Welcome to Utah Lake Explore More, the official podcast of Utah Lake Authority. I'm Sam.
And I'm Courtney.
And in this podcast, we'll explore one of Utah's most important natural resources, Utah Lake. We'll talk with recreation experts, community leaders, conservation professionals, and the people who know the lake best. And now that we're done with our canned responses, we're going to be honest with you. We're out of our comfort zone. This is new and different. We're going to be trying to figure things out. But if you'll excuse Courtney and I, we're looking at our notes for today because we really wanted to get this started. So we hope you guys enjoy this episode.
Yeah, today we're going to dive right in. We're going to talk about the history of Utah Lake. We're going to start off talking about the ancient giant of Utah Lake. Some of you guys may have heard of Lake Bonneville. Lake Bonneville is the ancient ancestor of Utah Lake. Utah Lake originated about 8,000 years ago, and it's a direct descendant of that massive Lake Bonneville. And how do we know this? So you guys have probably heard of like ice cores and how scientists take that. They do the same thing in the lake. So they can take core samples of the sediment in the lake bed, and they use that to analyze the calcium content and other things like that to determine just how old the lake bed actually is. Also, this was kind of an interesting topic, but let's think about how Utah Lake must have looked during the Ice Age. That was about 12,000 to 8,500 years ago. During the Lake Bonneville time, there was actually some mammoths and prehistoric bison that roamed the area, which is so crazy to think about. Like, picture like a giant mammoth walking around the middle of Utah.
It's kind of crazy. Makes me glad we named our hockey team Mammoth.
Now it kind of makes sense. Yeah. And during the Lake Bonneville time, there was insanely lush lakeside greenery, and that really made the ecosystem able to hold such huge megafauna during the time. And as the area started to become more and more arid and more deserty like the Utah we know today, those megafauna died out / just moved, and they were replaced by the modern bison, elk, deer, and antelope that we see today.
Well, then there's also the Utah Lake of today, which I gotta start by saying I think it's so funny that I feel like there's no rule whether we call a lake something or something lake. Like, why is it Lake Bonneville but it's Utah Lake? Why is it Great Salt Lake but Lake Powell?
I've never thought about that.
I don't know, but it bugs me.
That's really interesting.
Really bugs me because you'd think it would be called Lake Utah, right? And then maybe we wouldn't have Utah County, and Utah Lake to deal with. Anyway, side tangent.
It's in Utah, if you couldn't tell.
Right, and they were really original with the naming.
Yes.
Current Utah Lake, some fun information for you guys. The Utah Lake is actually the third largest freshwater body west of the Mississippi when you talk about surface area. It's almost 150 square miles of water surface area. For comparison, that's 32 times larger than Deer Creek and 30 times larger than Jordanelle Reservoir. So we're talking a massive, massive water body here. It's 24 miles long from the longest part from up near Lehigh all the way down to Goshen and Genola on the north to south. Then east to west at its narrowest, it's about 5 miles from Pelican Point, just south of Saratoga Springs, over to Orem, or at its widest, which is from the eastern edge of Provo Bay, down by the East Bay Golf Course and such, all the way across to Mosita is about 13 miles. So it takes up about a quarter of Utah Valley. That said, it is on average only 9 to 10 feet deep when it's full. So it's a very shallow valley bottom lake. And that's important as you'll learn more about the lake with us on the podcast, because you can't compare Utah Lake, which is a naturally occurring, shallow valley bottom lake, to high water mountain reservoirs and expect the same results and the same ecosystem and even the same wildlife in some cases. So there's a little bit for you about Utah Lake as it stands today.
Yep. So in 1847, that's when a lot of the settlers started to arrive here in the valley. Mormon pioneers arrived around this time, and the Ute Indians, the local tribes, are the people who taught them how to survive in this arid environment and taught them how to grow crops and how to fish in the lake. Originally, there was 13 species of native fish in the lake, including the June and Utah suckers, cutthroat trout, and other chub, sucker, and dace species, along with a lot of others. So because of all these fish, they had a really long time of prosperity. They had lots of food for a while, but in 1848, so just about a year or so into their settlement here in the valley, a brutal frost came, and it killed almost all of their crops. And then, just after that, the infamous crickets arrived to eat and destroy the rest of the crops. And so a lot of destruction followed this time of settlement and of people moving in. And so these limited crops also meant that they had limited livestock. And so they kind of experienced for the first time this huge famine and this food shortage in the valley. Their saving grace was the fish in Utah Lake. The fish from the lake were the only thing preventing total starvation. And so fishing companies started rapidly organizing during this time.
Unfortunately, this led to a period of really reckless fishing on Utah Lake.
Yes.
They became to rely on it as the main food source and fished there so much. There's actually a quote from, there's a documentary made called the Utah Lake Legacy documentary created by the June Sucker Recovery Program back in the 1990s. In the 2000s. And in that, there's actually a quote from a local church leader where he said, "Hey, brethren, we've come together as leaders and discussed that you at least need to go home to your families at night and go to your church meetings on Sundays. You can't fish all the time." People were fishing so much that they weren't taking care of their families. They weren't going to their church meetings, and there probably were other obligations they were dropping. As a result, the lake was overfished, and a lot of the native species that were there were decimated. So there became a lot of different challenges from what had been a saving grace of the valley, from the behaviors of humans being reckless in fishing the lake too much.
So we have some kind of interesting quotes to throw in just here. So this guy named George Washington Bean, I don't really have any background of him, but
Sounds
in
like a fun name,
1854, yeah, I know, not the George Washington, but
George
a
Washington
George
Bean.
Washington.
Maybe it's the Bean Museum? Maybe.
Maybe. He said, "Indeed, so great was the number of suckers and mullets passing continuously upstream that often the river would be full from bank to bank, as thick as they could swim for hours and sometimes days together." So it sounds like there was like literally a sea of fish at that time.
I've even heard quotes of people saying from pioneer diaries and such of the era that they, I'm assuming this is facetious, but that they could walk across the backs of the fish without getting wet.
Jeez.
As it was coming down the river. Right, there's another one that you've got listed on here from Clarence Merrill from the 1850s as well, where he said, "Fish were plentiful in those days in all streams around Provo. We could get all we wanted when we irrigated our crops. There would be plenty of fish on the land after the water had sunk into the ground." Gosh, that hits the point I was talking about of the reckless years, right? We didn't talk too much earlier about how irrigation affected water as well. There weren't a lot of restrictions or regulations about how irrigation happened or how fishing happened. And as a result, you get a situation that's talked a lot about in economics about now I just forgot the phrase, the something of the commons, the issue
Tragedy
of the commons.
of the commons.
Thank you, the tragedy of the commons. Appreciate that.
Yep.
Where, unfortunately, sometimes when you got a public resource that isn't managed, people overuse it because they are incentivized to use it. They want to have as much as they can have out of it. And that definitely happened with Utah Lake. That hits on one of the last points we want to hit on today, which is talking a bit about the ecological cascade that we had at Utah Lake. Why a pristine lake, something everybody loved and used, has turned turbid, and why the fish have vanished, right?
Why is the lake so dirty, Sam?
Yeah, I love that one. My first response as you to people is it's literally dirty. It's dirt in the lake, right? So water fights is something we have to be aware of. We mentioned that a moment ago, that there was a lot of contention over how irrigation should happen in the lake and how people wanted to be able to have their own access that they wanted. Population was growing, farmers needed irrigation, dams and canals got built, Provo River was redirected. All of these processes were focused on the human element here in the valley, and they were not attentive or weren't aware or weren't making the right decisions on what the effect was on the lake. And that resulted in the 1890s across not just Utah Lake, but the entire nation. We've got the Dust Bowl happens, right? This was a massive challenge in Utah as well, and it caused a lot of the rivers to be drained. Utah Lake shrank to an average depth of just 1 foot, which for anybody who's been on Utah Lake very much knows that it was most likely a series of puddles around the lake, not one contiguous section of water. In fact, referencing the Utah Lake Legacy documentary and book again, it actually talks about things like a mock boxing fight was actually staged, and you can see the picture of the guys putting up their fists and their dukes. I believe there was actually even motor car races out on the lake. People wrote stories about walking across the lake bed without getting wet. This was shocking, and this was a huge shock to the ecosystem in particular. And this caused a lot of issues, in particular for the June sucker, which is a species of fish that is endemic only to Utah Lake. You can only find it in Utah Lake naturally. And that species and others were decimated by this water loss.
Yeah. So what better time than when all these fish species are at their lowest than to introduce our good friend, the carp. So in the 1880s, carp were introduced to the lake Not by accident, but on purpose.
Yep.
Because at the time, they were a popular food source worldwide.
That was considered a delicacy.
Yeah, it was a delicacy worldwide. Really interesting to think about that now.
Yeah, consider how people think about
no
it
one
now,
eats them
right?
At all. But yeah, and they were introduced because they were really hardy fish, and so they thought that it was going to become this reliable food source to get them through any other famines or any hard times like that. And they were brought all the way from Europe, all the way to North America, and then shipped by railroad to Utah.
Oh, I got a story on this one too.
Okay, yes, please.
Okay, the June Sucker program recently did a presentation for us at one of our board meetings, and they actually showed pictures from when this was happening, when they were shipping the carp and other fish.
Really?
The federal government shipped fish all across the United States, and they put them on trains in rail cars, and they had a name for them, and I forget it at the moment. But the point I wanted to share is there's actually a photo that shows that they would actually give you discounted tickets if, when you rode on the train, you agreed to spend it in the fish car, putting a perforated bucket, so a metal bucket with a whole bunch of holes drilled into it. They would put it up and down into the water to aerate the water to help the
Whoa.
fish survive better as they crossed the U.S.
That's interesting.
So you could actually get discounted train fare if you participated in shipping the fish
you tended
by
to the
helping to
fish.
aerate the tanks manually.
That's so interesting.
So that's kind of crazy that like there was this many fish being shipped everywhere across the U.S. and carp was one of the ones that was successful. There's actually a BYU study that talks about, I forget how many, it's probably in the neighborhood of 30 to 50 species of fish that they tried introducing at Utah Lake specifically. Everything from American eel to all kinds of stuff that you may not have heard of, and carp included in that one as well. Carp was obviously the most successful one at Utah Lake.
Wow. Imagine if we had eels in the lake.
No, it's not.
I would
don't want
prefer that. I would prefer that over the carp.
No
That'd be
interest
really
in an eel,
fun.
in my opinion.
So we know a lot about the carp. They have caused a lot of havoc in the lake. These guys are aggressive foragers. They are bottom feeders. And so they not only do they eat the pondweed and other vegetation in the lake, they also stir up all the sediment that's at the bottom. And this is a big reason that the lake is dirty or not clear, is because all that sediment that's at the bottom of the lake bed is just constantly being churned up by these fish. And as they rip out that native vegetation from the lake, they are taking away any and all structure of the lake bed. So those native plants, their main job is to hold down all that sediment and to make sure that it's not circulating through the lake. So as the carp are eating all of these plants, they're just releasing that sediment and making it looser and looser. And so the problem is just worsening itself over time.
The point is carp. Carp are bad.
Yeah, so
Carp
if you
cause
haven't-
problems at Utah Lake. We want them gone.
Yes, if you haven't gathered already, carp are very bad. They're bad, and we want them gone. So they cause this chain reaction of no plants, they cause loose sediment, and that causes cloudy green water, which causes algae blooms, and eventually it can cause a shortage of oxygen in the lake, and that can be bad for anything and everything that lives there. So in 1986, the June suckers went on the endangered species list, and this was after they reached a population of less than 1,000 individuals. That's just an estimation. It could be a lot lower than that.
True, I think
knows?
I've heard the number as low as 300
Yeah.
by some people, but it's
Me
kind of
too.
hard to count fish, right?
Yeah, it's always
You
just
can't
a bit of an
exactly ask them to hold
estimation.
still
Yeah,
while you count them in
exactly.
the lake. It's not really a thing.
Yep. And so we talked about earlier how there were 13 native species in the lake originally. By the time the June sucker was listed on the endangered species list, only 2 native species remained. And
Sadly.
so out of those 13 native species originally, we only have 2 left. And those 2 species are the Utah sucker and the June sucker. Do you have anything else to add, Sam?
I think that's going to be it. We're going to bring back more in our next episode because there's more to talk about in the history of the lake.
Yes, stay tuned to hear the rest of the history of Utah Lake. And thanks for joining us for this very first episode of Utah Lake Explore More. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Utah Lake, and subscribe to our YouTube. And until next time, get outside, explore more, and we'll see you at the lake.